"Start it, Grandpa," Kyle Kramer shouted, his voice cutting across the sun-bleached flight line, laughter bouncing off the tarmac and metal fuselages. Eli Vance didn't flinch, his pale blue eyes steady beneath a cloud of white hair, gaze tracing the contours of the dormant A-10 Thunderbolt II. The rotor blades drooped lazily in the mid-morning heat, a soft hum vibrating through the cracked concrete beneath his scuffed boots. Around him, a dozen young technicians in pressed flight suits whispered among themselves, their laptops open, screens glowing with green checkmarks that promised a perfect system, yet the engine refused to turn. Eli's hand hovered near the edge of the intake, calloused fingers brushing against the cold metal as if listening for a heartbeat hidden inside the steel. Kyle leaned closer, smirking, arms crossed, a fresh lieutenant with all the arrogance of a 26-year-old certain he understood every lever and gauge before him. "You sure you know what you're doing, old man? These are modern jets, not relics from your Vietnam stories," he taunted. Eli's lips quirked, a faint smirk barely visible, voice low and gravelly. "Colonel Harrington sent for me. I'm here to make sure she wakes." The air shifted, heavy with tension, the scent of hot metal and jet fuel mingling with a distant aroma of sun-warmed tarmac. A small leather pouch, worn and scarred with decades of use, peeked from Eli's jacket pocket. He drew it slowly, each movement deliberate, as if the weight of years and memories guided his hands. Within it lay a stubby custom wrench, its edges smoothed by endless repairs, and a roll of sealing tape that had once held together a chopper under fire, relics of a battlefield long past. Eli knelt, tracing a path along the intake panel with eyes that seemed to see the machine not as a heap of modern technology, but as an old companion whose secrets he knew intimately. The hum of distant engines and the shuffle of nervous feet faded as his mind slipped into memory. Rain-soaked jungles, the smell of cordite and wet foliage, the creaking of rotor blades under fire, his hands steady while others panicked, saving lives with nothing but skill and instinct. The ghost of those days clung to him as vividly as the sunlight glinting off the A-10's canopy. Airman Jake Wells, standing a few meters away, noticed the subtle precision in Eli's stance, the way he adjusted his weight, the tilt of his head, and felt a spark of realization. This was no ordinary retired veteran. He slipped his phone from his pocket, fingers flying across the screen to alert Colonel Harrington. The young lieutenant scoffed, brushing a bead of sweat from his brow, certain the old man was playing some slow, sentimental game. Eli's hands moved methodically over the engine cowling, not a word spoken, only the faint metallic clicks and the soft scrape of his wrench against hidden fittings. The sun glinted off the worn metal, highlighting gouges and scratches earned in decades of service. Each mark a story, each dent a lesson. Kyle's smirk faltered as a low, almost imperceptible vibration started to pulse from the engine, the A-10 responding subtly to the touch of a master. The hum grew louder, harmonics aligning, a deep purr resonating through the landing gear as the control panels blinked green in agreement. Wells's eyes widened, the realization dawning. Eli was coaxing life from the machine that no modern manual could fix, guided by memory, intuition, and a lifetime of hands-on experience. Somewhere down the line, Colonel Harrington was moving, his presence imminent, drawn by the whisper of competence that only a true veteran could radiate. Eli's gaze lifted briefly to Kyle, calm and unshakable, eyes conveying years of quiet authority and unspoken history, and then returned to the engine, fingers dancing with purpose, coaxing, adjusting, commanding. The sound shifted, a steady roar building as the turbines awakened fully, echoing across the flight line, startling birds into the sky and freezing the young technicians in place. Kyle's mouth opened, but no words emerged, just disbelief. The air crackled with silent awe as the impossible unfolded, the old man standing at the center, a conduit of experience and quiet power, proving without a single boast that mastery never ages, that respect is earned in the space between silence and action. The engines of the A-10 now alive under the hands of a legend who had never needed anyone to believe in him before. The roar of the A-10 engines settled into a steady rhythm, a deep purr that vibrated through the soles of boots and the cracked concrete beneath. Eli Vance straightened, hands brushing against the cool metal of the intake one last time, eyes glinting with quiet satisfaction, while the younger technicians remained frozen, staring at the turbine in disbelief. Kyle Kramer's mouth moved, forming words that never escaped, a stunned silence replacing his earlier smug laughter. Airman Jake Wells stepped closer, the subtle shift in the vibrations through the metal telling him this was no ordinary mechanical fix. This was mastery incarnate, decades of experience distilled into every touch. The sun glinted off the A-10's canopy, casting sharp reflections across Eli's lined face and emphasizing the calm precision in his movements. Sparks of dust rose as the jet idled, heat shimmering along the fuselage, a living testament to the bond between machine and mechanic forged in another era. Eli's gaze swept across the flight line, taking in the young crew, their rigid postures betraying awe and uncertainty, then returned to the engine, eyes narrowing slightly, as if listening to secrets only he could hear. In his mind, the triple canopy jungles of Vietnam flickered in parallel with the present, rain-slicked rotor blades, coiled tension, and the smell of wet metal and cordite, a symphony of lessons learned under duress, now quietly guiding each turn of his wrench and adjustment of the throttle. Colonel Michael Harrington appeared at the edge of the flight line, his polished boots crunching softly on gravel, eyes locking onto Eli, recognition and respect radiating before he even spoke. "Eli," he said, voice low but carrying across the line, "I see you did not forget." Eli's lips twitched in a brief acknowledgement, no words needed, the roar of the engines providing all confirmation. Kyle Kramer finally swallowed, shoulders slumping, the overconfidence drained by witnessing skill that bridged generations. Jake Wells exhaled slowly, a subtle nod to Eli that this was more than just an old man operating machinery. This was history in motion, legacy and expertise converging into a single moment. Eli touched the edge of the cockpit, fingertips brushing the metal as if caressing a familiar friend, and then stepped back, giving space, letting the A-10 live through its own power, the vibrations thrumming through the line, a silent announcement of competence and authority. The younger technicians shifted, hesitant, yet unable to avert their eyes from the demonstration of mastery, the balance of confidence and humility that Eli embodied. And in the quiet heat of the day, even the distant birds hesitated mid-flight, as if paying tribute. Colonel Harrington approached closer, hand lightly on Eli's shoulder, a weightless acknowledgement of years of unspoken service, of knowledge honed in heat, rain, and the delicate touch of necessity. The flight line was alive with anticipation, but Eli's demeanor remained composed, eyes steady, as if the engine's roar was a conversation only he understood. Kyle Kramer's earlier smirk had dissolved entirely, replaced with a mixture of astonishment and respect that could not be fabricated. Jake Wells finally spoke, voice low, careful not to disturb the cadence of the moment. "Sir, she is responding to you, not the controls." Eli's slight nod confirmed it, the tacit communication between man and machine a quiet echo of countless days spent perfecting his craft. The heat waves rising from the tarmac wavered in the morning sun, casting shifting patterns across the jet's surface, highlighting every panel, every scar, every testament to function and resilience. Eli stepped fully back, gaze sweeping the line, the young officers frozen in silent observation, Colonel Harrington's presence anchoring the scene, a witness to decades distilled into a single demonstration. And in that suspended moment, the flight line itself seemed to recognize the balance of past and present, skill and respect, patience and authority, all converging around the simple, unspoken truth. Mastery endures, and it speaks loudest when words are absent. The engine's roar settled into a commanding hum that filled the morning air, vibrating across the concrete of the flight line and rattling the open panels of nearby aircraft. Eli Vance stepped back, his gaze scanning the A-10 as if reading the machine's mood, fingers brushing the metal with the familiarity of an old friend. The younger technicians and officers remained frozen, eyes wide, mouths opening and closing without sound, caught between awe and disbelief. Kyle Kramer's arms fell to his sides, posture slumping under the weight of his own arrogance, now humbled by experience far beyond his years. The heat rising from the tarmac shimmered around the A-10, sunlight reflecting off every rivet and panel, casting long, moving shadows that traced the contours of the jet like a living sketch of precision engineering. Eli adjusted his stance, slight shift of weight, the subtle movement carrying the rhythm of decades of discipline and knowledge. He had learned long ago how to feel the heartbeat of a machine, the quiet signals that no instrument could measure, the vibrations and the sound frequencies that whispered secrets only a seasoned hand could interpret. Airman Jake Wells took a careful step closer, the faint scratch of boots on concrete a soft counterpoint to the steady growl of the engines, eyes tracing every movement of Eli, recognizing instinct honed into expertise. In his mind, Vietnam's wet jungles and sun-baked clearings flashed momentarily, the tactile memory of tightening bolts, adjusting panels, coaxing life from machines that no longer wanted to move, hands steady, heart calm, mind alert. Eli's expression did not change, calm and controlled, yet the authority radiated in every deliberate motion, commanding respect without a single word. Colonel Michael Harrington approached, boots firm on the ground, uniform impeccable, eyes locking onto Eli's steady gaze, an acknowledgement of decades of service silently communicated without a sentence exchanged. Kyle Kramer shifted uneasily, the past tension replaced by recognition of skill, of authority unearned by rank but by mastery, and he felt the quiet weight of humility settle in his chest. The wind lifted dust across the line, swirling in patterns around the jet as the turbines now emitted a pure, controlled roar, the sound a symphony of metal and air, mechanical harmony, guided by a hand that had earned its place in history. Eli glanced briefly toward Colonel Harrington, nodding almost imperceptibly, then returned attention to the A-10, checking minor adjustments with careful touches, each movement precise, confident, yet understated. Jake Wells exhaled slowly, awareness dawning of the rare display of competence, a lesson in patience and observation as much as in mechanical skill. Kyle finally swallowed, eyes lowering, realizing that the gap between his youthful certainty and Eli's experience was vast, unbridgeable in a single lesson, yet the silent demonstration taught more than words could convey. Sunlight glimmered across the fuselage, highlighting the scars and patches, each telling a story of service, survival, and precision. Eli stepped fully back, the engines humming with readiness, the jet poised to move at his command, a bridge between past and present, skill and respect, and the quiet acknowledgement that mastery is measured not by show, but by results and the calm authority to achieve them. Colonel Michael Harrington stood beside the aircraft for several long seconds, saying nothing. The silence carried more weight than any speech. Around him, the technicians shifted uneasily, pretending to check tablets and diagnostic screens while stealing glances toward Eli Vance. The morning sun climbed higher, washing the flight line in bright white light. Heat shimmered above the concrete, blurring the distant hangars into wavering shapes. The aircraft continued its steady idle, every vibration smooth and controlled now, every sound exactly where it should be. Eli listened carefully, head slightly tilted, eyes half narrowed. Then he took 3 slow steps toward the left engine and stopped. The subtle change in his posture immediately caught Jake Wells's attention. The young airman had spent enough time watching Eli to recognize that something had drawn his focus. Not a warning, not a problem, something else, something small, something important. Eli rested one hand against the fuselage. The metal felt warm beneath his palm. His eyes drifted toward a maintenance panel located several feet below the wing root. It looked perfect. Fresh fasteners, clean paint, factory alignment. Every technician who walked past it would have ignored it completely. Eli did not. His gaze lingered there. Kyle noticed. "What is it?" he asked quietly. For the first time since the engines came alive, there was no sarcasm in his voice. Eli did not answer immediately. A faint breeze crossed the flight line, carrying the scent of fuel and hot metal. Somewhere in the distance, a transport aircraft rolled along a runway. "That panel," Eli finally said. "Who signed off on it?" Several technicians exchanged confused looks. One of them raised a hand. "I did, sir." The word "sir" came out automatically. The young technician seemed surprised he had said it. Eli nodded slowly. "Did you remove it?" "No, sir." The diagnostics showed everything inside was operating normally. Eli looked back toward the aircraft. The corners of his mouth tightened slightly. A memory surfaced. Not the jungle this time. Not rain. Not rotor blades. A dusty airfield beneath a pale orange sky. A crew chief standing beside him decades ago, teaching a lesson that never appeared in any technical manual. The old chief had pointed toward a perfectly functioning aircraft and said, "The machine tells you what it knows. The metal tells you what it feels." Eli had never forgotten. The memory faded. He reached into the worn leather pouch and withdrew the same stubby wrench. The sight of it drew curious looks from everyone nearby. Colonel Harrington folded his arms and watched closely. He knew that expression on Eli's face. It meant a lesson was coming. Eli crouched near the panel and ran his fingers across one corner. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he tapped lightly against the metal surface. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound was almost identical each time. Almost. Jake heard it first. A tiny difference. A faint hollow note hidden beneath the others. Eli looked up toward the technician who had signed the inspection paperwork. There was no criticism in his eyes. No accusation. Only patience. "You trusted the computer," Eli said softly. "That is not a mistake. But sometimes the machine only answers the questions you ask." The young technician swallowed hard. Cal stood completely still. The aircraft hummed steadily behind them while the lesson settled over the group. For the first time that morning, nobody was looking at the engines. They were all watching the old man. The young technician knelt beside Eli, suddenly aware that every eye on the flight line had shifted toward the maintenance panel. The aircraft continued to idle smoothly behind them, its steady vibration rolling through the concrete like distant thunder. Eli handed over the stubby wrench without ceremony. The tool looked insignificant in the technician's hand, worn smooth by decades of use, its metal polished by countless repairs. "Open it," Eli said. The technician obeyed. Several fasteners came free. The panel swung outward. For a moment, nobody spoke. Sunlight spilled into the compartment, revealing rows of components that appeared perfectly normal. Kyle Kramer leaned forward. Jake Wells stepped closer. Colonel Harrington remained where he stood, watching with the patience of a man who already knew how this lesson would end. The technician glanced up. "Everything looks fine." Eli nodded once. "Look again." The younger man squinted, examining every connector and bracket. Sweat formed along his forehead despite the morning breeze. Then he noticed it. One support clamp sat slightly out of alignment. Barely noticeable. Less than a quarter inch. Most people would never have seen it. The technician's eyes widened. "That cannot be causing all this." Eli's expression remained calm. "It is not causing all of it. It is causing enough." The words settled over the group. Kyle stared at the compartment. Computer diagnostics worth millions of dollars had overlooked what Eli spotted in seconds. The technician carefully touched the clamp. It shifted slightly beneath his fingers. A tiny movement. Almost nothing. Yet everyone watching suddenly understood. The issue had never been large enough to trigger a warning. It had only been large enough to create inconsistency. Enough to confuse sensors. Enough to create false confidence. Enough to waste hours. Eli folded his arms. The breeze tugged lightly at his faded jacket. For a brief moment, his attention drifted elsewhere. The bright morning faded. In its place came another flight line from another lifetime. Not modern hangars. Not polished equipment. Dusty aluminum structures beneath a pale sky. Young crew chiefs moving quickly. Engines whining. Radios crackling. A gray-haired mechanic standing beside him 40 years earlier. The old mechanic had tapped a wrench against an aircraft's skin and smiled. "The day you stop listening is the day the machine starts lying to you." Eli had carried those words for decades. The memory faded. The present returned. The technician adjusted the clamp. Small correction. Simple adjustment. Nothing dramatic. Nothing heroic. Eli nodded toward the panel. "Close it." Several minutes later, the compartment was sealed. The engine note shifted. It was subtle. So subtle that most people would have missed it. Eli did not. Colonel Harrington did not. Jake noticed it too. The rhythm had changed. The aircraft sounded lighter somehow, cleaner. The vibration through the concrete became smoother. Kyle slowly exhaled. He finally understood why Eli had never argued, never defended himself, never responded to the mockery. The old veteran had known something Kyle was only beginning to learn. Real confidence did not rush to prove itself. It simply waited for results. Around them, the technicians stood in complete silence. The aircraft hummed steadily beneath the bright American sky, while Eli slipped the worn wrench back into the leather pouch. To everyone else, it looked like an ordinary tool. To Eli, it carried 40 years of lessons, mistakes, victories, and long-forgotten voices. The flight line felt different now. Quieter, more respectful. And for the first time that morning, nobody saw an old man standing beside an aircraft. They saw a master standing beside his craft. The aircraft continued to idle beneath the bright afternoon sky, its steady hum no longer a source of frustration, but a quiet reminder of what had just happened. No one hurried back to work. No one seemed eager to break the moment. The flight line felt suspended in time. Eli Vance stood near the nose of the aircraft, one hand resting lightly against the metal skin, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the runway. The younger technicians watched him differently now. The skepticism was gone. In its place sat curiosity, respect, questions they were suddenly too cautious to ask. Kyle Kramer shifted his weight and glanced toward Colonel Harrington. The colonel had not left. That alone surprised him. Officers at his level rarely lingered after a problem was solved. Yet Harrington remained exactly where he was, studying Eli with the familiarity of someone who knew far more than everyone else standing there. Jake Wells noticed it too. The airman had spent most of the morning observing reactions, and one detail continued to bother him. Colonel Harrington never seemed surprised by anything Eli did. Not once. As the breeze moved across the runway, Jake finally gathered enough courage to ask. "Sir," he said carefully, looking toward the colonel, "how do you know him?" Several heads turned immediately. Even Kyle looked interested. Harrington remained silent for several seconds. The wind tugged gently at his uniform. In the distance, another aircraft rolled toward a taxiway. Finally, the colonel smiled. It was not the smile of an officer speaking about a consultant or retired mechanic. It was the smile of someone remembering a legend. 23 years ago, Harrington said quietly, "I was a second lieutenant." The technicians exchanged glances. Harrington rarely spoke about his early years. "I was assigned to a temporary maintenance team during a readiness exercise. We had an aircraft grounded for 2 days. Experts flew in from 3 different bases. Nobody could solve the problem." Kyle listened closely. Jake did not blink. Harrington looked toward Eli. "Then someone told us an old civilian contractor was passing through." A faint smile appeared on Eli's face, barely visible. Harrington continued. "He walked onto the flight line carrying that same leather pouch." Several eyes immediately moved toward the worn bag hanging from Eli's shoulder. He listened to the aircraft for less than 5 minutes. Harrington shook his head slowly. Then he fixed the problem before lunch. A few technicians laughed softly in disbelief. Harrington did not. Afterward, I asked him how he figured it out so quickly. Jake leaned forward slightly. Even Kyle seemed completely absorbed. The colonel's expression grew thoughtful. "Do you know what he told me?" Nobody answered. The steady hum of the aircraft filled the silence. Harrington looked toward Eli again. He said the machine had already told everyone the answer. Most people were simply too busy talking to hear it. The words settled heavily over the group. Eli never looked up. He simply stood there, watching the horizon beyond the runway as sunlight reflected softly from the faded leather pouch. For the first time all day, the young technicians realized that every lesson they had received from manuals, software, and simulations represented only part of the craft. The rest came from patience, observation, experience, the things no computer could download and no classroom could accelerate. And standing before them was a man who had spent a lifetime collecting those lessons one quiet day at a time. The afternoon sun drifted lower across the base, stretching long shadows from the aircraft and painting the flight line in gold and copper. Work had slowly resumed around them, but an invisible circle remained around Eli Vance. Nobody crossed it casually anymore. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered jokes. The atmosphere had changed. The younger technicians moved with greater care, checking details twice, listening more than speaking. Colonel Harrington noticed it immediately. Experience had taught him that respect earned naturally lasted longer than respect demanded. Eli remained near the aircraft, seated now on a simple maintenance crate, the worn leather pouch resting beside him. His hands were folded quietly, the same hands that had spent decades solving problems others could not even see. Jake Wells approached first. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. Sir, can I ask you something? Eli looked up. You already are. A few nearby technicians smiled. Jake nodded. How did you learn all of it? Not the manuals. Not the technical stuff. The other part. Eli glanced toward the runway. A transport aircraft climbed into the bright sky, engines fading into the distance. For several seconds, he remained silent. Then he answered, by being wrong. Jake blinked. The response surprised him. Kyle Kramer looked over from a few yards away. Eli continued, people think experience comes from success. It does not. His voice remained calm and steady. Experience comes from mistakes you survive long enough to remember. The group listened carefully. Nobody interrupted. The wind shifted across the concrete. Somewhere a flag snapped sharply against its pole. Eli reached down and rested one hand on the old leather pouch. His fingers paused on a faded scratch running across the flap. The sight pulled him backward through time. Suddenly, he was no longer sitting beneath a clear afternoon sky. He was standing on another flight line decades earlier. Younger. Faster. Certain he knew everything. The memory was crystal clear. He remembered ignoring a senior mechanic's advice because he believed the instruments more than the man. He remembered spending nearly 12 hours chasing the wrong answer. He remembered the older mechanic sitting patiently nearby, without saying a word. When Eli finally admitted defeat, the mechanic solved the problem in less than 10 minutes. Not because he knew more technology. Because he understood people often stopped observing the moment they became convinced they were correct. The memory faded. The present returned. Jake noticed a faint smile crossing Eli's face. What happened? He asked. Eli looked at him. The old mechanic bought me coffee. Several technicians laughed softly. Then he told me the most expensive thing in aviation is confidence without curiosity. The words landed heavily. Even Kyle lowered his eyes for a moment. Colonel Harrington folded his arms and nodded. He had heard that lesson before. Years ago, from the same man. The flight line remained quiet afterward. Not uncomfortable silence. Thoughtful silence. The kind that appears when people realize they have been learning something far more valuable than aircraft maintenance. The sun continued sinking toward the horizon. Golden light reflected from the aircraft canopy. Eli sat calmly beside the machine, while younger men studied him with newfound respect. For the first time all day, they were no longer interested in how he repaired the aircraft. They wanted to understand how he became the man capable of doing it. The light of late afternoon began to tilt across the flight line, long shadows stretching from aircraft and equipment, catching the edges of tools, crates, and panels in sharp relief. Eli Vance remained near the A-10, hands clasped behind his back, posture straight yet relaxed, eyes observing the younger technicians as they tentatively moved, careful not to disturb the rhythm of the moment. The hum of the engines was steady, a background pulse that seemed to bind the air around them, a quiet authority that had no need for speech. Colonel Michael Harrington stepped closer, the soft crunch of boots on concrete breaking the stillness just enough to remind everyone of his presence. But his eyes never left Eli. Kyle Kramer stood slightly apart, arms crossed, attempting to mask the mixture of awe and unease settling over him, while Jake Wells lingered near Eli, sensing a lesson in patience and observation unfolding before his eyes. Eli lifted a hand, gesturing subtly toward the aircraft, indicating the technicians should inspect the gauges and controls. They obeyed, moving slowly, deliberately, as if under a gentle command they could not see but could feel. Each meter, each dial, each switch revealed nothing new, yet the tension in the air grew because everyone knew they had witnessed something rare. A man who had mastered his craft without showing off, whose skill was so complete that the results spoke louder than words ever could. Eli shifted his gaze to the horizon beyond the runway, where the sky met the distant tree line, the sunlight catching in the canopy of the A-10, reflecting a spectrum of light across his lined face. Memories flickered behind his eyes, not of machines, but of lessons learned quietly, moments when listening had revealed truths no instruction manual ever could, times when observation and patience had saved hours, days, and lives. He glanced down at the leather pouch, the worn edges familiar beneath his fingers, the instruments and tools inside carrying decades of experience. Colonel Harrington nodded ever so slightly, a silent affirmation, and for a few seconds, time itself seemed to pause. the flight line suspended in a shared understanding that the past and present were converging in this one quiet, commanding presence. Kyle Kramer exhaled slowly, a subtle gesture of surrender to a lesson larger than any textbook or simulator could teach, and Jake Wells felt a sudden weight of reverence, the realization that mastery endured beyond age and appearance, that respect was earned by consistency, calm, and competence. The engine's hum seemed to rise and fall with Eli's breathing, synchronized with the heartbeat of the aircraft and the collective attention of those around him. Shadows lengthened further across the tarmac, and the warmth of the sun highlighted every crease, every scar, every indication of past effort etched into the metal and the man alike. Eli finally turned his gaze back to the young man, pale blue eyes meeting theirs steadily, calmly, the quiet authority in them unmistakable. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and stepped away from the A-10, allowing space for the aircraft to exist under its own power, a final testament to skill and patience, and the younger men watched in respectful silence, understanding that the lesson was complete and that they had been in the presence of someone who had lived mastery in every measured motion for decades. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the tarmac and turning the metallic surfaces of the aircraft into molten gold. Eli Vance remained standing near the A-10, hands clasped behind his back, calm and measured, while the younger technicians and officers lingered close, their movements hesitant, their eyes wide with the silent awe of having witnessed skill that transcended manuals, metrics, and modern machinery. Kyle Kramer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Colonel Michael Harrington, who had remained at Eli's side throughout the afternoon, arms folded, expression composed yet full of quiet acknowledgement. The engines of the aircraft purred steadily, vibrating faintly beneath their feet, a rhythm that seemed to echo the accumulated experience of decades and the patience that only time could teach. Eli's gaze swept the flight line, absorbing the details, the subtle imperfections in panels, the faint traces of wear on tools, the discipline and curiosity in the younger men standing nearby. Each movement was deliberate, purposeful, a demonstration of confidence earned, not claimed. Memories surfaced, faint but vivid. Distant airfields under pale orange skies, the careful guidance of senior mechanics, the sound of turbines waking under hands that knew precisely how to coax them alive, lessons learned in quiet moments between chaos and routine, repetition and observation shaping instinct into expertise. The wind carried the scent of fuel and hot metal, mingling with the warmth of late afternoon sun, and the faint creak of the hangar doors opening and closing in the distance added texture to the stillness. Jake Wells finally found the courage to speak, voice low and respectful. "Sir, will you show us how to listen the way you do?" Eli's pale blue eyes met his, and for a moment, the air seemed to hold its breath. Then he nodded once, almost imperceptibly, a quiet signal that the teaching had begun even without a word. Colonel Harrington allowed a small, approving smile, a recognition that the transfer of understanding did not require ceremony, only presence, observation, and patience. The younger men moved closer, each step careful, purposeful, sensing the rhythm Eli had established, aware that every glance, every adjustment, every silent pause contained lessons they had never encountered in textbooks or simulators. The engines continued their gentle hum, a continuous undercurrent to the quiet instruction unfolding, the aircraft itself almost participating in the exchange, vibrating under the hands and gaze of the man who had mastered it in ways the years alone could not teach. Shadows lengthened across the tarmac, painting intricate patterns that shifted with the angle of the sun, highlighting the lines of the jet and the subtle movements of its caretaker. Eli adjusted the leather pouch at his side, a relic of countless days spent refining skill and observation, and the gesture spoke volumes about the depth of his knowledge and the careful accumulation of wisdom over a lifetime. The younger men absorbed the quiet authority radiating from him, understanding without prompting that mastery is silent, patience is measured, and respect is something that flows naturally to those who prove themselves through competence, humility, and the unspoken confidence of a lifetime spent in service to craft, machine, and principle. As the golden light bathed the flight line, Eli stepped back fully, eyes scanning the horizon, the A-10 gleaming in the sun, engines purring with readiness, and all who stood nearby felt the weight and calm authority of a man whose skill and presence commanded respect without a single demand, leaving the flight line suspended in a shared, reverent silence that would endure long after the engines fell quiet.